All right, so we are live. I apologize for the delay. I know a lot of you are not watching this live, so what I'm going to do is the first thing I'm going to make these videos shorter. If you are watching it live, you can always live chat while we're doing this. In fact, one of the reasons I'm sticking with live chat, you're going to see a lot of videos pop up, is that it actually uploads cleaner and it uploads faster. So you'll see it show up faster, so it's available to watch. So for those of you that are watching this video right now, I'm going to add a link to it in the announcements after this. I'm going to do half-hour segments, so you're going to see a lot of videos pop up in the next couple of days. I will add that to the announcements. I want to get out almost all the lecture videos out in the next couple of days. I have been in very poor health. I am social distancing. But hopefully I get all the videos out and then I'll have the prep, and then when you ask me questions I can actually respond very quickly. But because I'm distancing, right, that don't come to class, don't be here, I am sort of isolating, so I haven't gotten the results yet back, but I'm just, as a precaution, right, I'm going to avoid all interaction. So if you need to talk to me, you can live chat during the videos if you watch it live. Now, if you're not watching it live, there is a chat window in Web Campus, and if you want to chat via that, that's possible. You can also email me, and you can set up a WebEx. If you email me and you're like, I need to talk to you in person, I need to be able to, right, obviously in person's out of the question, but if you want to talk, do a video chat, that is possible, and we will see how that goes. So I know you're just seeing like a background video, which is kind of a mess. It's just, when I switch to this, it's hard for me to actually see if the aspect of it is coming through. So I'm really hoping that you're watching. What you're looking at is end of chapter 16. So I'm going to do a review of chapter 16. And then after I do this review where I finish up chapter 16, then I'm going to make a separate video that's just chapter 17. That's going to be a little bit longer. And then I'm going to do a sagebrush finishing up video for just chapter 11. So those will be caught up before Thanksgiving. But you don't have to watch this Thanksgiving. Take your time, spend your time with this. I have started reaching out to individual students, right? There are very few students who don't, there are only about 4 students who are either at risk of failing, and I've already sent out messages, and hopefully we'll get to a path where we can get through, right? I want to work with you. This is a very unique situation. You were told this was to be an in-class person, and now I am saying it is not going to be an in-class person for the rest of the semester. So if you're struggling, message me, and we'll come up with an individualized plan for you to at least pass the class, right? I'm not going to say you're going to make it all the way back to an A, right? But if you were struggling, I will break my rules about not makeups, because I feel like we're still in a special situation. I did this during last semester because of this, and it would be unfair for you not to have the same situation. I think I have one paper that I still have to grade, but everything else should be in. So if you're not like happy about your grade, you know, that's a communication. But if you are over 93%, right, you already have an A in the class. So just kind of look at that, determine where you want. If you're on the cusp of an A- or a B plus A-, and you're like, how do I make my grade better? Take the last exam. Remember, my final exam is not unique. The final exam is the same as all the other exams, it just happens to be during finals week. So it's going to look exactly the same. All right, so let's get into the lecture. I really hope you're looking at this redistribution. Okay, perfect. There is a slight delay, but I'm good with that. So when you look at this redistribution aspect, right, this is just how taxes work, right? You have redistribution, and this is a little bit of review. We're going back, if you haven't noticed, right? We covered fiscal policy, we covered progressive and regressive taxation. I'm going to make a separate video about marginal utility of the dollar. Marginal utility of the dollar is actually a very important concept, but I'm not going to be testing you on it. I think it's probably too advanced for this course. Although I think you'll get it. So you're going to see maybe in the next couple of days a few videos, and if they say optional on the title, and this, I don't think this video has a title, but if they say optional in the title and you're not watching them live, right, or I will say, hey, this is an optional video. One is I'm going to get my whiteboard. I have a whiteboard in my home, and so I'm going to, you're going to see a screen, you're going to see a split screen of me and then the board. And hopefully if I can get that to work, right, I'm going to show you why marginal utility is functional, but that'll be optional and not testable. It's more about your information. So I'm going to split those two things, right? And I will tell you when we're going to be doing something that is optional versus something that is clearly testable, right? And then in the last exam, right, remember, I'm going to be looking primarily at the material in the last section, but without a doubt, there will be a question about initiatives and referendums and other aspects of Nevada, right? The initiative process, right? Direct democracy. Okay, so all of that will be in the last exam. Redistribution is just how taxes work. You tax individuals, right, or businesses. You take that money and you give it to people who are or aspects of their lives where they need help. And right, remember, in the United States, we're always talking about equality of opportunity. So you're not trying to just make their lives better with funds. You're trying to fund them in such a way that they can eventually become taxpayers, right? That's part of the plan of the American system. So when you're thinking about this aspect, right, remember that there is always a goal that you are redistributing wealth specifically so that you can get those individuals out of poverty, so that you can provide them education. Right? When we talk about redistribution, sometimes we always talk about taxing wealthy individuals and then sort of giving people, welfare or food stamps or whatever. But remember, most taxation will go to, what we'll see is going to the elderly, right? That's Medi-Cal, Medicare, health costs, right? And then education is a huge part of this, right? That public schools have to be funded, and very few people would argue that we should get rid of public schools, right? That's a high issue, right? And we know that for a good economy, we need an educated public, right? So even though you're taxed a certain amount to pay for education, it's less than the amount you would be taxed if you have to support all these people with no education, right? And that spills over to higher education as well, right? Why is your tuition lower in state than out of state? Because it's covered by state taxes, right? And funded by state property taxes and things like that. So redistribution is a necessary part of a society, right? You have to tax in order to provide for those people. And the idea is that when you tax wealthy people and businesses, what you end up is that those people who are in poverty and who are sort of dealing with sort of disparities or difficulties, that you provide them not just with resources, but also sort of education, training, benefits that get them to a better situation and get them into practice. So that's always the way that we want to look at it, right? As redistribution is how do we take money from wealthy individuals, but use that money to get people who are in a bad situation out of that situation, right? Remember, as an American system, it's never just about let's just provide you permanently and the source of income. It's always temporary assistance, right? The temporary assistance is always part of this language in the American system. There are loopholes. We talked about this, right? One is a business expense, right? If you are a private contractor, you can expense almost everything, right? And to cover some expenses over the summer, right? Because with the pandemic, things, right? You go into business for yourself, Uber driver, whatever it is, right? Postmates, and then you expense everything. You expense the maintenance on your car and the gas and everything, so that you can say, look, I made a certain amount of money, but right, you always want to expense as much as you possibly can, right? To lower your tax burden. And then corporate inversion, we talked about, that's essentially, corporate inversion doesn't just mean, that's not its pure definition, but a corporate inversion often means this idea of you taking your manufacturing and your employment and moving it overseas, and you somehow get a tax break for that. And that tax loophole has existed in the United States for a while. It's hard to explain why people haven't overturned it, but it definitely benefits corporations when they want to take their labor force overseas. And normatively, right, I don't have an opinion about that, right, but most Americans would argue that they want a manufacturing base here, whether or not that's a functional aspect. But the idea that we're actively helping corporations move their labor force overseas, right, sort of goes against sort of American ideals. And because of that, right, there's always this question of why does that loophole exist, right? And it's much more complicated than is worth getting into in this course. All right, so when you're a government, right, one of the things you're always worried about is a budget deficit. So you know how much you're going to get in taxes, or approximately what you're going to get in taxes in each fiscal year. And you know how much spending is going to be in your budget. And a deficit is any amount that exceeds that. And typically, we have seen in the last, 100 years, that the expenditures by the government have exceeded the amount that they brought in, right, in one way or the other, right? The total budget, the total amount of debt, right, even though it's sort of split among individuals as well, right, is increasing every year. right? And we've talked about that as well. The other part is mandatory spending. So mandatory spending is anything that you just can't not pay for, right? This is uncontrollable budget items, right? And there's no way that you can stop this. And in 2016, around 69% was uncontrollable. And what do I mean by uncontrollable or mandatory, right? Often this means something that an individual is entitled to, and not sometimes when people say entitled, they mean, oh, they think they're entitled and they're not really. What I mean is actually entitled, legally entitled to these things, right? And the most obvious example is Social Security. So in Social Security, you pay into it your whole life, and then, right, you are legally, right, entitled to a certain amount of money based on how much you paid in throughout your lifetime. That's how Social Security works. So the government can't deny you Social Security based on income, right? It's not income-based, it's not need-based, right? You paid into it and you get it. So Warren Buffett, who is one of the richest people in the world, he gets a Social Security check because, right, at retirement age, or when he declared retirement or whatever it was that allowed him to be eligible for Social Security, he gets a check from that. Now he is a billionaire, right? That money makes very little difference because there's a maximum amount that you can get, right? So it's not exactly, changing his life, but he's still collecting on that because he paid into it, right? That he's legally entitled to that, right? And so it's not a normative question of entitlement, it's a legal question of entitlement. And when you have all of these schemes together, right, you add in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, right? And then legal requirements about education, right? You have to pay for these individuals to go to school. Right, that takes up 69% of the budget in 2016. It's actually increased a little, so it's in the low 70% today, right? And, right, we have all of these other things that are happening, right, especially with the pandemic. So when 70% of your budget or higher is mandatory spending, only about 30% can be discretionary spending. And this is where we look at anything like climate control spending or new programs or infrastructure, right? And as Americans, one of the things is we have had it's been a long time since we had a good infrastructure bill, right? So our infrastructure is very problematic. It's sort of wearing down. It needs repair, and it's just not getting that repair. So when you're talking about discretionary spending, one of the reasons it doesn't come through as quickly is why we don't solve some problems as quickly. Obviously, very large problems, we just borrow and sort of go into make a larger budget deficit to try and work through problems like the pandemic or the recession or things like that. But discretionary spending is much more difficult when you say, here's a problem that we need to spend money on, but there's only so much money to go around, and there are way more problems than the amount of funding that exists, right? There are clearly more problems than the funding exists, right? Because we know that there are school districts who are underfunded. We know that roads need to be repaired, roads and highways need to be repaired, right? We know all of these things need to happen, and we're already going into debt based on how much we're spending. So trying to find money to solve all the problems is difficult when you're talking about discretionary spending. And part of the reason that it's so difficult is because mandatory spending has created this need for so much of the money to already be spent, right? And you could think about this as just your bills, right? That you have to pay rent and your car payment, and these are things you cannot. So when you're left with the amount of money you have left, right, for like groceries and utilities, right, that those are things that are discretionary. And by utilities, I mean the amount of utilities you use, not having utilities, right? And so when you're thinking about your personal budget, right, what is discretionary, right? Going out to eat is discretionary, but also food is a discretionary spending, just how much, right? You have to have food, but do you stay home and eat ramen the whole month, or do you go out to eat, right? That's discretionary spending, right? That you're going to spend a certain amount, but you can change how much it is, whereas some things are uncontrollable. We're talking a little about regulation, and one of the things is that in the sort of early 20th century, it became very clear that single markets or single firms, single businesses, and at times single individuals could just control all of the goods and services of the market, right? And this is the robber barons, right? The railroad owners, right? That one small group could control all of the thing, and it would give them what's called market power. And the problem with market power is the way that it works. So if you want to be a monopoly and you have a large percentage of the market share, right? Say you have 55% of the total business in the market, right? Whatever you're selling, right? You sell ice cream and you own 55% of the ice cream sales. What you can do is, as a monopoly, if you're trying to become a monopoly, is you can plummet the amount, the cost of that of your ice cream, right? You can decrease your cost dramatically below your competitors. And because you have enough money and resources, you can survive as a business for a few years at a much lower price point. And basically, by having a very low cost, because you have economy of scale, remember, you're larger your business, you can actually, economy of scale means that you can have all of these farms producing, and it causes the cost of production to decline, right? And for those of you that really haven't gotten into this marginal utility of the dollar and economy of scale, right? These are just things as businesses grow, right? It becomes easier to produce. Certain aspects become easier to produce, and you can produce them at a lower cost, right? If you have one person, working in a store, they have to do everything, right? But if you have multiple people working in a store, one person could be specializing in the front of the house, and one person could be specializing in cleaning in the back of the house. And because they're specializing it, they'll get more efficient at it. But also, right, that the efficiency is there, but also as you get larger and larger, right, if you own the land, right, you don't have to rent out the land, or you don't have to pay some middleman to get your product. So there's a lot of economy of scale aspects that are there that you will be discussed probably if you have to take an econ or something like that. And so because you, as a monopoly, or as someone who's as a firm aspiring to be a monopoly, you can just cut prices for a while, and you will drive those smaller businesses who don't have that economy of scale, who don't have those resources to lean on when they're underselling their products. You can drive that price down, and you can drive those in firms out of business. And what will happen is once you get to a certain percentage of the market share, 55% is actually quite high. That's pretty close to monopoly because the way they calculate a monopoly. But once you get a strong monopoly going, then you own so much of the market that you can jack the price up. And this is one of the concerns, right? Is you drive everyone out of business, right? So Walmart doesn't actually do this. They're monopolistic competition, which is not great, but still problematic, but also not great. But it's not a monopoly in the way that they work. They just keep their prices low and treat it as if there are no competitors, but they actually make very little per product, and they work on a different business model. So Walmart's not exactly the example. But if you're a monopoly, as the old cell phone companies, or AT&T was as a phone company, when they own the iPhone, right? First they get everyone with the free phones, and then before AT&T branches out and you can get an iPhone on any market, then all of a sudden AT&T plans and phones are very, very expensive because you can only get through AT&T, and that's market power. The only way you can get this product is through this firm, and therefore they can charge you at a much higher rate than would normally be acceptable. For those of you that look at sort of gaming companies, right? There are only two firms that are really left in doing a large share, right? Nintendo's always going to be around, right? But right now we're talking about two very large firms, and they're setting the price, right? And there's very little that customers can do. And so as the United States, monopolies aren't good for business, right? You want businesses to be competitive. You want small businesses to trying to buy up market share and competing against larger firms. And so what was created was this antitrust policy. And so what happens is if your company grows too large, and we saw this in the 90s with Microsoft, is that the government can force you to split your business, right? And basically, they did this in the 1990s, where they forced Microsoft to split between a hardware company and a software company. They forced them. They said, you are a monopoly right now that is unacceptable. You are going to have two different aspects of this business, right? And you're going to completely split your corporate entities. And for a few years they did, and eventually they went in court and they sort of reconnect into one Microsoft because they proved that they didn't have a trust, a monopoly because of other companies. But then two, they ended a practice where in the 90s, if you bought a computer, every computer came with Microsoft Windows. And they still do, but all of the products came with it for free. And that was a way that they could sell other aspects, right? That they just sort of worked with every computer was a Microsoft computer. And that's why the only computers that don't have Microsoft software are Apple computers, right? That's sort of that market share, right? Apple trying to fix that sort of monopoly Microsoft had over software for a long period of time. That's how you sort of break it up. What we have seen is deregulation, right? There are very few regulatory restraints on a lot of these companies, especially tech companies, right? There's been a lot of deregulation to move against larger and larger firms. There was a Glass-Steagall Act, right? And they sort of tried to prevent one firm or one business or one market sector from controlling too much. And it was repealed, and there's not really a clear sign because it allowed banks and sort of hedge funds and firms, right, to firms that were sort of high risk and banks which are supposed to be low risk to be one company, which is very damaging to the banks. But that deregulation occurred. It's not clear if that caused the recession, but it definitely made the recession worse because the banks were more exposed than they normally would be. So if you have, on one end, if you have a monopoly, right, that means the product is sort of being controlled by one firm. On the other end, there are some products that do not do as well either at first or ever. And so often what you do is you subsidize them. And one of the aspects about subsidies is that you typically have something, and I'm going to use soybeans, right? Soybeans actually aren't really great cash crops. They make a small amount of money, right? But compared to like almonds or dairy, right, the profit potential isn't really there. And so we need soy, right? For a whole host of reasons, you need to make sure that we have domestic soy production, rice production, things like that, that are actually not high cash, they're not cash crops, but they're necessary. And so what was decided, even right, Hamilton's Report on Manufacturers, right? This is Alexander Hamilton. So this is the beginning of the 19th century. So this is 200 years ago. Hamilton realizes that if we really want to be a strong economic power, what we have to do is we have to promote certain aspects that will eventually pay off, right? And so subsidies, as part of this, starts out with how do we make sure that infant industries, right, like the automobile, right? The automobile is not subsidized, but there was a discussion about it being subsidized in the turn of the 20th century, right? Because we wanted to, and other countries have subsidized their manufacturing, the automobile manufacturing. So you want this industry to take off because you know how valuable it is, right? Korea did this under Daewoo, right? They funded their car company until it was ready to go out into the global system. It went out to the global system. It made Korea a much more economic system, and then Daewoo was bought out by other companies. But the idea is that if you want to give these sort of aspects of it support, right? These industries support so they can get off the ground, or for some things permanently because they're necessary, right? If you look at why is there so much milk in a American education system versus other education systems, it's because the government subsidizes dairy. And they subsidize dairy at such a point that they say, well, we're going to pay you a certain amount for your production, or we're going to insure your farm, so if you have a bad year, you can claim that loss, right, and then survive as a dairy farm. Now, dairy farms are still not doing as well because sales are down in the 21st century, but this is a very new problem where people just aren't buying the product anymore. But when you have that many subsidies, what happens is the government says, okay, we subsidize you, so what you're going to do is you're going to sell us all of this milk at cost to provide it to our schools, right? That's why you see milk rather than juice or just water being served in a lot of elementary schools and K through 12 systems. So that's part of that subsidies aspect, right? That they're going to provide to make sure the product is readily available at a low cost, but also because they provide that, they are going to expect. The other part about a subsidy, right, is that you sometimes want to promote activity, but sometimes you just want to reward support. So we know that in the 20th century, especially as the sort of food pyramid is being developed, that a couple of companies, specifically the dairy industry, really starts campaigning for their aspect, for them to be a big part of the food pyramid. And they are supportive of a lot of these politicians who are on the agricultural committee, right? The agricultural committee ends up making the food pyramid. And so they are able to influence that the amount of servings of dairy you should have each day is higher because of these connections, right? So when we talk about the food pyramid in the past, and this is not a normative argument, I know that I'm clearly biased because I'm a vegan, right? But one of the aspects is we know that food pyramid, that original food pyramid, is definitely influenced, and we saw its influence occurring by a lot of these companies. And so the dairy industry said you need this in your daily diet, and because you need the diet, it's very important for the American people to have it, and therefore you should subsidize it. So this becomes this sort of circular aspect where you support a political candidate, right? You support politicians, and then they become senators and representatives in the House, and then they reward you with subsidies, right? And so this is not problematic necessarily, but part of the system that we live in. The other part is this idea of contracting power, right? And this allows the government to say, if you're going to sell a product in the United States, this is exactly what we should expect, right? This sort of sets these standards that we want, or these conditions, but also it allows you to sort of set up a situation where you can say, I want this from you, and you just continue sort of setting them up to say, okay, I want this type of product. And it just so happens that the only company that makes this product is Lockheed Martin. And so if you don't know Lockheed Martin, right, it's just a company that the Air Force works with, right? They sort of have some no-bid contracts, but also they're between Lockheed Martin and Boeing. There are only really two companies that know how to have the facilities and the ability to make new fighter craft and new technology when it comes to aviation. So you have this sort of setup where, yes, the government's setting the conditions in order for these companies to sell to government agencies, but also, right, it creates this idea of what we consider a military-industrial complex. And this is from Eisenhower, right, that we have these companies that only sell to us, right? Lockheed Martin primarily sells to the United States government, and because we're buying all of these weapons, one of the concerns about a military complex is you're buying all these weapons, you're incentivized to use them. And we saw that, I think this is almost 4 years ago now, that the current administration, right, the Trump administration, actually this is maybe 2 years ago, they dropped a bomb called a MOAB, a mother all bomb. It's a very large bomb, but the thing is they had the bomb and they could drop it, but it had no benefit, right? It was very expensive, a bomb that was destroying a large amount of area, but they were just using it because they had it and because it was, oh, we dropped this very large bomb and sort of political press and political gains, but it didn't actually change the outcome. And this is what Eisenhower worried about, right? You're buying these large weapons, and so you feel the need to use these large weapons, but they're not really doing what you want them to do. They're really just for political gain. So the last part we're going to talk about, is the environment and the economy. So it wasn't, there wasn't a recognition that you could damage the environment before today, right? Before sort of climate change became, global warming, climate change became these sort of larger issues that we're talking about today. But in 1969, the United States got a really big sort of wake-up call, what they would call a wake-up call. This is Cuyahoga River. And so for years, they had just been dumping everything into the river, right? And the same is true for most rivers, right? If you look at the waterways around New York City, the waterways around LA, there's so much dumping into those waterways, and anywhere around an industrial park, that the water is very contaminated. It's not drinkable. But what happened in 1969 is the water was so contaminated, and because industrial waste and oil floats above water, right? There's an expression that water and oil, they don't mix, right? They literally don't mix, right? That's chemistry. And so most of the oil and waste was actually floating on top of the water and never caught fire. And one of the things is that the way that they fight fires in 1969 is the boats would actually pump water from the river. That's how they would fight the fire. But if the water you're pumping is so contaminated that when you spray it onto the fire, it just sets on fire, that the water is so polluted that it can continue to catch on fire, right, for several hours, right? There was no way to put this out, and it just had to burn itself out. Now, when you have a fire on a waterway, it will eventually burn itself out, but how many homes are going to be destroyed in the process, right? But this became a wake-up call. And so eventually, over time, we see the government, right? Nixon actually creates the EPA, right? And then you have this recognition that there needs to be some environmental standards, even though we definitely have conservatives saying there shouldn't be as many environmental standards, it's costing us more, right? This is a reasonable debate to have, right? How do we have a functioning economy and yet make sure that our environment is livable? And so there are three different policies, right? The policy approaches. And the first is mitigation. And so mitigation has actually been successful politically. And this is just reducing emissions. So by 2025, there was an expectation that the standard or the average amount of miles per gallon, right, was going to be 54. Now we're still well below that. We're sort of stuck in the sort of 30s. Sometimes estimated and then real is very different. The roadways are actually bad. So if we had better roads, we'd have better miles per gallon. So we'd have an infrastructure bill that would help that a little. But we're sort of in the 30s, maybe going into the 40s if you're getting a smart car or hybrid or something like that. We should expect, because one of the things about this is that electric cars actually count as having like they don't use miles per gallon, so they use energy cost per gallon, but they essentially raise this a lot. So the more electric cars, you can also have sort of still have muscle cars, and as long as the balance averages out to about 50 miles per gallon by 2025, that's still going to reduce the emissions, right? That's one way that we can sort of help with this, is just reduce how much we actually create, right? Sometimes we talk about this as your carbon footprint, reducing your carbon footprint, and that's one way, just reduction. Right, but we know that reduction is not going to be enough. Right, there's still so many pollutants, so much pollution, and so many issues with the environment already. And so then there's this idea of promoting green technologies. Right, so this green economy has actually become a huge thing. And one of the reasons why Democrats have been very successful is because why manufacturing jobs are difficult to bring to the United States, and coal jobs are definitely going away. The reason why that's occurring is because many of these green technologies are actually very functional and economically sound, right? We live in Nevada, right? Solar technology could run everything, right? We live in an environment where solar power could easily cover every aspect of our needs, right? And right, Tesla has talked about like batteries in homes and stuff like that. It's not going to happen this year, but in the next year and the next few decades, right, we'll probably see renewable technology cover almost everything that is necessary, at least in the Las Vegas area, because it's so beneficial. The other benefit that we talk about is that a lot of money that goes to sort of oil, especially oil, right? We know that oil money typically goes to regimes that support terrorism. And this is sort of a dated aspect, right? Now that we see a lot of these move out of their current situations, but sometimes we talk about rent behavior and rent-seeking behavior. And this is where the government, instead of taxing their people, goes after the resources. And usually that money is more likely to support inappropriate behavior because it's not connected to taxation. So we know that if we sort of move away from spending money on foreign resources like oil, then that money will go to less problematic issues. But also, more importantly, I mean, not necessarily more important, that's probably a bad way to put it, but more directly, right, that instead of going and buying energy from somewhere else, we're producing energy. And that means less money going out, which means our trade deficit isn't as bad, which means that we can start going into less debt. So one of the things about the US economy is that it's unlikely that we'll ever try and pay down the debt, but eventually we'll sort of lower how much we're taking on each year, and because of inflation, it'll be less and less of a problem. If we went into debt 1% every year, we went into 1% greater debt every year, but inflation was 2%, like in economic terms, we would be better off. And then the last part is an adaptation policy, right? We can try and promote renewable energy, and we can try and reduce our carbon footprint. But one of the things that scientists have agreed upon is that the 70s and 80s were really the last opportunity to stop climate change from occurring at all, right? So we have some climate change that already has arrived. And adaptation policies can really be a shift in behavior. One of the things that is very strange is we had a warning about zoological, and the coronavirus is considered zoological, and that means it's coming from animals, closer people and closer populations because of the way that we live now, right? And so we're more likely to have epidemics. And so adaptation policies deal with, less social interactions, less mobility, right? Right? We've already discussed this as climate change scientists have already talked about these sort of coming pandemics and these coming natural disasters and sort of being prepared, right? We see more places of building higher seawalls or building ways to sort of block out monsoons and tsunamis, right? And they're just sort of raising the elevation of their land, right? To sort of accept that climate change is here, and now what do we do about it? One of the things that's the Maldives is a very wealthy country in Europe, and it has bought it is a very small population, I want to say about 300,000 citizens. It basically bought land in a much more northern part of Europe, and so it's like, oh, if the Maldives eventually goes underwater, we'll just move to somewhere else, right? That's a very extreme case, right? It seems like they don't really believe that climate scientists or governments will respond, but other adaptation policies, right, include behaviors like clean air days and recognizing when you should go outside, right, and sort of changing our behavior and creating new technology that deals with climate changes here. Now, what do we do? And so you probably, especially now that we've been spent most of this year in a pandemic, right, you will probably see a lot more science and funding going towards climate change mitigation because pandemics and climate change, they're not disconnected, right? They do have some high correlates. Okay, so that is going to be this video. In about 5 minutes, you're going to see another live stream come up. If you miss any live stream and you're sort of watching this review, they're going to pop up as they do because the computer takes its own time in sort of processing them through. But I'm going to do chapter 17, and I'm probably going to continue on today. I'm feeling okay. So I'm going to do chapter 17, then I'm going to do the Sage for State, and then we should be caught up. And then I'm actually going to do a few more videos to get ahead. I don't expect you to watch them all. So if you're watching this one, don't feel like you have to get them all before Thanksgiving. Have a good Thanksgiving, right? Decide how you want to live in Thanksgiving, right? Whether you're going to see family or not, right? We have a lot of controversial decisions to make in the next week or two. So just try and be safe. And then as these videos show up, watch them on your own time. And then you should see a video that about review at the end of this. That's the last video. This is going to be, okay, what do I really want you to know? What are the expectations? How can I prepare you for exam 4? And then you should see an exam 4 prep quiz, right? That's not worth any points, but just so you can sort of ramp up to exam 4. And then exam 4 will be 40 questions, just like all the other exams. And then once you take exam 4, it'll open up at the beginning of finals week. Once you've done that, then everything will be in, right? That's the last thing that is in. So if you have any questions, email me. You know how to get a hold of me, right? I will respond as quickly as I possibly can. I haven't been that healthy, so I'm sometimes up in the middle of the night. So if you get a response at like 2 a.m., that's just my sleep schedule. It's all kinds of messed up. But otherwise, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.